was first referred to back in the 1950s. It was Alan Turing and his report on computer machinery and intelligence, which proposed a test of a machine intelligence called The Imitation Game, which people might remember as a movie and book. But what about generative AI? Surely generative AI is very recent. Actually, no. Generative AI was first introduced in the 1960s via chatbots. However, it wasn't until 10 years ago, in 2014, with the introduction of generative adversarial networks, a type of machine learning algorithm, that generative AI could actually begin to convincingly authenticate images, videos, and audio of real people. Okay, so enough of a history lesson. I want to introduce our speaker this evening, who is the real AI expert. Professor Susan Ariel Aronson is a research professor at George Washington University and director of the Digital Trade and Governance Hub. Susan is also co-principal investigator with the National Science Foundation and National Institute of Standards and Technology for Trustworthy AI in Law and Society, where she leads research on data and AI governance. Susan is a regular commentator in the United States on technology policy, and she's in Australia on tour thanks to the generous support of the US Department of State, which helps the United States Studies Centre bring out American experts in emerging technology. So, the title of our event tonight is Governing AI: How are governments engaging with artificial intelligence? Generative AI has dominated the headlines across the world for the past couple of years. Popular models include OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, and image generators like Midjourney, which I think is that one where you basically put in a prompt like dog riding on a horse in space and you get a picture of something. But basically, governments have been grappling with how best to regulate AI, and not all governments have been going about that regulation in the same way. In the last year, the US Biden administration issued an executive order on AI safety and security. China introduced several AI-specific regulations. The Group of Seven, the G7, agreed a set of AI principles and a code of conduct, and the EU advanced negotiations on an AI Act. So with that, I want to actually start off by asking Susan a sort of broad question to kick off, which is all about how do we get to this moment in time where we're using generative AI? Is it the harbinger of doom, like so many people say, or is it actually going to really help us in our lives to come? What does the future look like, Susan, for generative AI?
Well, first let me say thank you all for coming out tonight and welcoming me, and it's so nice to see all of you and to be back in Australia. I haven't been here for 25 years, and when I came to APEC at the behest of the Australian government, so I feel very privileged to be here today. I am trained as an economic historian, which means that I study how institutions and ideas and policies change over time. And so your question, I think, is really difficult for me as someone trained in history to answer. But that said, I think what's unique about foundation models, so I'm going to use that term rather than generational AI, because I think that is the term of art by which governments increasingly are thinking about this. And there are so many different types of AI that is difficult to predict its utility or its future. But we can say this: most economists now believe that generative AI, and I think I said generational, I don't know why, but that's called jet lag, believe that basically it is a general purpose technology, which is a term of art to say that AI will underpin almost every sector. So that means whether you're in banking or you're in education, you will be using various forms of AI. AI is simply sophisticated statistic that uses huge amounts of data, the highest computing power, really good computer and data science and systems engineering expertise, etc., to try to predict, to find patterns in the data, to predict how humans will behave, groups of humans as well as individuals, and perhaps it will be used to solve wicked problems, which we all desperately need, right? Or not solve, but mitigate wicked problems, such as climate change or pandemics. I would like to be optimistic about it, but what I see is a bubble. And everybody knows what a bubble is, whether it's, we're talking about tulips, right, the Dutch. What I see is a huge amount of investment, right, going into a particular technology, and that worries me. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but I am saying that there is a cost to doing so that you might not be using in other technologies. So let's see what happens. The other thing that I forgot to mention is that it is a dual-use technology. And so it is used for the civilian economy, and it is used for the military economy in almost every nation. And that has impelled government officials around the world to believe that they must invest in foundation models. So I'll just take as example France. So France, a couple of years ago, set up a very large data set and brought about 500 scientists to France to set up a program based on their research and their advice called Bloom. And the idea was that that data set and that AI that they would create would be open. And it was placed on a platform owned by Hugging Face, which is also a French company. And that was open source. And one of the problems is that a lot of governments are afraid if they're going to be investing in this technology, they wonder, should they share it with the world? And I think that's a debate that we don't hear enough about. So we can talk about that.
Susan, you mentioned how AI is basically created by the use of going through data, huge amounts of data, what people call training data. I try to understand a little bit more about how AI comes together and the type of training data that is used. So that's sort of used to generate the content and develop like the prompts which we give it. So what are the sources of the data that is used to create AI, and what controls can be put in place?
I think we need to be really careful here, because if we're talking about generative AI, there's two strategies to get that data. But other types of AI use different kinds of strategies to get the data. What they all have in common is that they use proprietary data. So proprietary data, right, that is owned by the firm or owned and controlled by the firm. Proprietary data can include the algorithm, right? We call that source code. It can include data collected by the firm. So if the firm is Facebook, or if the firm is a government, so forgive me for saying this, that governments can act like a firm, but let me give you an example. The United Arab Emirates, which created a generative AI model called Falcon. So for generative AI, the way most of the data is derived, the data set is derived, is through a very, I think, unfortunate technique called web scraping. Now, web scraping has been around since the web first existed, and the idea was, we're going to scrape the web to get a sense of the health of the web. So what does that mean? Some sites have something called robots text, which say, you cannot take this data from this site, and yet there's no way to really stop. So the scraping is often done on an ad hoc basis to try to get a picture of the web. Okay, so web scraping allows you to get a sense, a very broad data set, but my problems with that is that technique is not meant to provide data for AI. That's the first thing. The second thing is yes, this is a hugely broad sample, but it also includes, when you scrape the web, you're getting lots of personal data, which you might not explicitly have sought to ensure that you got it legally. it includes a lot of proprietary data as well that belongs to other firms. The other thing that includes is what I'm going to call open public data. Now that data could be your comments on Reddit. Everyone knows Reddit?
Yeah.
Okay. It could also be your reviews on Google. It could also be your research, and it could also include proprietary information. So the problem with this is it is legal to scrape the web, right? Because it's a good thing. It was not designed to develop AI, but nonetheless, I get why people want to use various web scrapings, such as the common crawl. Okay, but when you're using that, you're basically stealing without permission. That doesn't seem a good way to get data. Yes, you're using your own data, right? The proprietary data set, but you're also taking data from content creators, personal data, etc., and public data, which is open to all, right? It can be government data, tax data, what the government is doing to help various tribes, indigenous tribes, etc. And that's okay to scrape it, but no one, there was no mechanism
It wasn't
to get
intended for that originally.
Yeah, and so again, it's a broad data set. But the other thing that concerns me, and I think we should all be concerned about, especially given your introduction, is there's a presumption that because you have such a large data set, that it is A, accurate, right? There's a lot of bullshit on the web. Complete. So complete means, do you really have a good sample that is complete, that will allow you to create the best algorithms that you can and the best model that you can? And I would question that. And finally, is it representative? When you were talking about various tribal communities in Australia, again, I come from a different country with a different culture, but that would not be talked about in general before the presentation started. And one thing I've learned from various tribes in the United States is they don't feel representative because much fewer numbers are online, right? And we know that 34% of the population is not online. They tend to be in countries like Mali or Guadalupe. They're not in many of these countries, not everybody can afford the internet, even the mobile internet. So these data sets are not generally accurate, complete, and representative. And that explains why so many generative AI models hallucinate. I am really uncomfortable with the use of these terms that use human terms to describe AI. And again, I think we've come full circle in it. One of my colleagues is a neuropsychologist, and she and I were trying to write a paper about, she calls it compassionate AI, but I think a better way to say is empathetic AI. And on one hand, I feel like the most hypocritical human being because here I am criticizing these human terms. But the objective is, can we create variants of AI that really take human needs into account? That when you're making predictions about human behavior, you're empathetic in how you do it, the way a human would strive to be.
We always like to put human characteristics on artificial things to make us, easier to understand and relate to, but that can often be a mistake. But I just wanted to, before we get into actually talking about resolving the challenge you raised, Susan, which is some of the regulatory challenges around the data scraping to actually use to generate these AI models, can you set the scene for us about which are the main country players in specifically generative AI? Basically to give people who aren't familiar with this area more of a baseline level about which countries are the major players when it comes to generating generative AI and the foundation models, and why are those countries so eager to get involved in this field? What is it about generative AI that's attracting these particular countries?
So the two things that I mentioned before, it's the belief, I cannot prove this to you, but there is a belief that it is a general purpose technology. So that's thing one. It's going to underpin all these sectors. And who knows if that is true. My gut is it probably is true, but we don't know yet, right? I want to give you an example of a general purpose technology. That would be electricity, right? It underpins almost all manufacturing. So that's thing one. The other is Australia, China, the EU, the United States, and I think soon Canada have declared that generative AI is a critical technology. Now, in the United States, Canada, the EU, a critical technology is defined as one that is essential to economic progress and to national security. Okay. Australia adds something like social stability to that definition, but I think that's interesting, and that is what is motivating so many governments, those two beliefs. Again, to be redundant, forgive me, but that it is a general purpose technology, they have to have it, and that it is a critical technology. So, in response to your question, obviously the United States, which has a huge share of the generative AI and foundation model market, the way that you can see this for yourself is just plug in AI leaderboards. And honestly, if you think about it, I'd be curious to know what you guys think. That is ridiculous. But, you know, models compete, right? It's a beauty contest, and so they get tested on all sorts of metrics. In any case, you look who's up, who's down. And GPT-4 is often up, but it's not always the number one. There are so many different types of leaderboards. Falcon was number one for a while on various leaderboards. But check it out. It's kind of a hoot. It adds to the sort of frenzy. Yeah, you know, it is, you know, making this in technology and science into a beauty contest, I think, is really unfortunate. But that's where we're at right now. And that's why I say it is a bubble of deep concern to me, because you know, this might pan out. It might be fabulous. We are seeing in science, it has allowed scientists to see patterns that they couldn't see before. And I think that that is fabulous. But for, you know, people around the world, it's not yet yielding fabulous results. If you're not a scientist, can I just ask, how many people have you know, raise your hand if your first introduction to AI was generative AI, whether ChatGPT or any other one. Has anyone not, I should have asked, has anyone not tried it? Has anyone found, okay.
No one wants to admit they've not tried it.
So, I mean, I don't particularly find it useful because it is so full of hallucinations. Okay, I'm a vain person. If you look up Susan Aronson using Perplexity, which is probably the best if you're a scholar, it's full of books that I did not write. It doesn't include the books that I did write. Maybe it has one or two of them. I don't remember the exact mistakes, but it's a hoot. Plug yourself into it. It is not correct. So I ask you, as you look into the mirror, ask yourself, why would you rely on something that these days is so inexact?
So Susan, can I go back to a point that you raised before, that a leaderboard for who's leading on generative AI, like which countries
well, saying
or companies?
Which model it is. It's not really saying which country, but they will list the country that it comes from. And it's not always a country, right? I mean, like Meta is a country in itself, in a sense, right? 2 billion members, or whatever they're called, constituents. Yeah, it's listed as the United States. Same with Gemini. So you asked who are the leaders. I mean, this should not surprise anybody. If you have comparative advantage as a firm, at the firm level, I should have said competitive advantage, you have access to huge data sets, computing power, right? So you've collected your own data. Right, and Google, how old is Google? 1997, so it's heading right towards, am I right, 19? It must be the 2000s. In any case, that's not a lot of time to get data if you think about it, compared to, let's say, ANZ Bank or Citibank, which have been around for 200 years and are also global. But they don't have the scale and scope that a Facebook or a Google or a WeChat have. That gives you a huge advantage because you own and control that data. Who knows where they store it, but they reuse that data. That is huge opportunity for those firms. And they have the expertise, and they can buy ever more expertise. And where they don't have expertise, they buy the company because they have so much money. That is bad for the world. We can talk about that at another point. But, okay, getting back to the question, so the United States, China, then I would say the other leaders in AI, they don't have the biggest companies, but they have, for example, expertise in a particular type of AI. So Brazil is fabulous in agriculture AI. The UK, Germany, it wouldn't surprise you to know that they are excellent in autonomous vehicles, right? Which use, what is a car? It is a computer on wheels. So the UAE has been buying it. I would say I would look to South Korea, which excels in AR, VR. I'm trying to think about
That's a long
countries.
list and also quite diverse list of countries there. It seems like they're all over the world. Can we talk now a little bit more about risks and risk mitigation around AI? So, for example, with the rise of generative AI, we've seen some concerning uses of it. My colleague Tom, he came up with a few for me. So, for example, ChatGPT came up with fake legal research. There was deep fake robocalls of President Biden telling New Hampshire voters to stay home and save their vote. There are also risks that are a lot more serious than just those sort of distorting policies. There's AI-enabled cyber attacks, scams, and also autonomous weapons. So, Susan, thinking about all of these risks of AI, I'm wondering what governments are doing now to try and mitigate some of these risks. I guess that they're trying to control AI in a way, but I'm wondering how much of a fool's errand is that? How successful are governments actually becoming at regulating AI?
Okay, well, there are 16 questions embedded in that question. But I would say on the AI safety front, the UK has led. And honestly, I think they've done a pretty good job. I think 49 nations signed the original AI safety principles. In the United States, that was part of the Biden administration's second executive order. Companies made commitments regarding AI safety. Now, these are commitments. It's no law, right? They don't have to adhere to their commitments. But one thing we didn't talk about is if you're going to sell products to business or to consumers, you better be building trust and be consistent and trustworthy in your product and services, any AI generated stuff. So there is sort of if the market arises, the market will have those factors. But on AI safety, I'm actually not afraid. But on the myths, for example, a risk that I am very afraid of is everyone remembers Cambridge Analytica, right? And what Cambridge Analytica was basically taking Facebook data about British voters and making predictions about how they would vote related to Brexit. And those predictions tended out to be quite correct. They took those predictions and manipulated these people. And that is my great fear for AI. I am less afraid about the mistakes, right? Because I think people understand, because of hallucinations, that they shouldn't. I hope these lawyers have a brain in their head and won't do this again. If I were creating a model, I would really strive to ensure that it was trustworthy. Now, how you do that is something else that we can talk about, but the point is, right now, these are not trustworthy, and so people they should play with them, they should try to make them better, but they shouldn't trust them. That's quite different, and they should be demanding that when such systems are used to make predictions about behavior, those predictions are not used, for example, to deny people their human rights. So what do I mean by that? You've probably heard about what happened in the Netherlands when the government relied on predictions about various people who didn't pay their taxes. They ended up taking their children away from them. They made a correlation that these people who didn't pay their taxes weren't good parents. Can you imagine, like this country that is, widely thought of as a bastion of human rights, took its own citizens and took away their children because they didn't pay taxes. So that's the kind of behavior that has to be banned. The Biden executive order says that, but there's no law in the United States, that except at the state level, the United States various states are starting to have such laws, but there is no federal law saying that AI can be misused. People will misuse it. We need to change the incentives so it isn't misused. But I fear that we're not there yet. So we do have, China has very strict regulations regarding the data. You're supposed to be more accurate, complete, and representative in China regarding the data. No other country is there yet. The EU AI Act, as example, I don't know what you think of it, but it is a risk-based system. The idea is that high-risk systems, people should have rights related to their use, but it is not in effect yet. It is not enforced yet. The EU set up an agency to deal with it, and we'll see what happens with that. So right now, you and I are unprotected, as are the people in the EU, from the misuse of these systems. But then again, many people fear regulation because they think that it thwarts innovation. If it regulated properly, it might stimulate innovation, right? Because people want to avoid those kind of risks.
And there's lots of business opportunity with AI going forward. Actually, I wanted to talk a little bit about the positives now that we've just talked about all the risks. So I'm going to ask a final question before I open it up to the audience for your questions. So please have a think about what you might like to ask Susan. But before I put it out to the audience, my next question is about the more positive side. Things that AI can offer are as an enabler. So for example, in many of our current jobs, we could be working faster, more creatively, more productively as part of an AI human team. AI could help accelerate scientific processes and discovery that could alleviate poverty, improve healthcare, address climate change, or enable real-time translation between humans, for example. Susan, is it likely that we're ever going to reap any of these possible benefits from AI in our lifetimes?
I'm sorry, maybe it's the jet lag, but I'm kind of laughing at this because honestly, yes, there's no doubt there are going to be benefits from various types of AI. Like I said before, the scientific benefits I think are going to be huge. For example, drug creation. But so far, most of the benefits are quite limited. And I worry that it is so overhyped. That is typical of a bubble. And, there are other technologies that I think could be more consequential that I worry about. We are not putting sufficient attention. The we here, I cannot speak for Australia, so the we here would be the United States. And I want to give the example of digital twins, because I think that technology is going to be huge. So what is a digital twin? So it's a model of anything that exists on Earth. So in the world right now, in the United States as an example, we have an agency called FEMA, which helps in time, it's the Federal Emergency Management Agency. But FEMA paid for a digital twin of various states that are prone to flooding. in the hopes that they could train people as to how to respond should a flood happen, which is inevitable. And digital twin, this is called, it's a variant of augmented reality. It's built on AI. So, and many technologies will be built on AI, like brain neural interfaces will be built on AI. But again, we need to think more carefully about how do we stimulate those kind of innovations when we are basically receiving innovations from giant companies that have few incentives to provide us with new innovations. I am really worried about any company that has 2 billion constituents that transcend the 192 countries of the world. The world doesn't know how to govern that. And I certainly don't know how to govern it, but I think it must be governed. You have many opportunities for governance, right? You can govern the behavior, you can govern the data, you can govern the type of AI use, you can govern the type of AI, I misspoke. You can govern the end use, right? Like I said before, you want to restrict certain types of AI use by, let's say, the government. And if you want a sense of AI in the world today, if you go to US AI.gov, I don't know if it'll be the exact same web location, it should be, but I don't know, for you all. And there is a place there based on the executive order, a link you can go to, and it goes by agency. It's this Excel spreadsheet that is huge now. And so it lists all the uses of these various agencies and how they use AI. I find it astounding how much AI is already used by, let's say, the Department of State, which is our foreign affairs agency. It's worth your time to look at, and I think it would be worth Australia, here is a little suggestion, that people demand to know how AI is being used by the government and for what purposes, and what are the safeguards over its use, whether it's being used to predict, citizen behavior, or it's being used to predict terrorism or whatever. It is very worrisome. And then who's the supplier of that AI?
Well, I opened with a positive question and it has become very dark.
I'm sorry, I'm not a dark person, but I think it's important that people not fall for the hype.
Well, with that warning, let me open it up to the audience for your questions. Please, someone have a more positive question to get Susan to tell me what the benefits of AI are. But any questions that you have that you're wondering, Becky, would you mind bringing the microphone over here? We've got one down the front with OJ. And could you please, when you do speak, just let us know your name and where you're from, because we have people watching online. But over to you, OJ.
Yeah. Hi, I'm OJ. I'm from the University of Sydney studying here, and I also wrote a policy brief for the United States Study Centre on how Australia can carve its position in the global value chain for AI foundation models.
I'd love to read that.
Yeah, thank you. I was reading your article on sovereign AI, which I also agree with, so that was great. But what I found is that in a recent report of the Law Council of Australia in a 2023 submission to the Department of Industry, Science and Resources, they discouraged a standalone AI Act, and instead they preferred having an expansion of legislation which is largely state-driven and leads to lots of different regulations throughout the states. What do you think are the positives and negatives of that as compared to having a nationwide sort of EU AI Act except for Australia?
Fantastic question.
Yes, it is a fantastic question, and I do not know enough about the specifics of the state or provincial level, to say anything.
But what about, Susan, you said in the United States there's state legislation that's governing AI.
Yes.
Would you prefer the US do a federal-based system where it's governed nationally, or do you think the state-based system is the way to go?
Well, I spent a lot of time yelling at various U.S. government agencies saying the first, and this has been true since 1997, right? You may recall we had a president, Bill Clinton, and he said something like, regulating the internet is like nailing Jell-O to the wall. despite that, in 1997, when the internet was young and innocent and freewheeling, forgive my sarcasm, the United States put out some principles called the Global Framework for E-Commerce. And in that, it said, trust is essential and we must protect privacy. 1997, 26 years later, the United States lacks, I don't use the word privacy because it's about many other human rights, but we don't have a federal data protection law. We do have various states that do have various data protection laws. That's insane. It is also insane that we don't have a global approach to trying to reconcile this. So the little think tank that I run for the past 4 years has mapped how nations govern various types of data. So we look to strategies, policies, laws, institutional changes, and then international agreements or treaties. And it is also shocking that there is no commonality among the world. Now I get it, right? Because what we're talking about is freedom of expression online, right? If your personal data is not protected, you're not going to feel comfortable saying your opinion on Twitter or X, right? So all human rights are linked. You may disagree with me on that, but that's the UN that says that. And without, privacy, people don't feel that they can assemble. So we lack those laws in the United States. And until we get there,
What's your position then, so just taking on OJ's point about what's the best approach, if you can't get something at the federal level, is it the best starting place to do things at the state level, get a collection of different policies together, and then look at something at the national level once you've got a bit more agreement between states?
most people would say that that's the logical way to go, but I think, unfortunately, that's problematic only because you end up with a patchwork, which is not good for innovation. I would like to see the world mandate transparency about data. So let's just, I think Facebook is a really interesting and important company that we need to think about, right? And they own various properties, right? They own Instagram, they own WhatsApp, they own Facebook. Okay. And so the reason I cite that company is that company has never told its constituents, its stakeholders, here's how we use your data. They constantly change the rules, okay, and for various platforms. And now Mark Zuckerberg, he recently gave a speech where he said, we don't need to trawl the web. We don't need web scraping. We have tons of data that we can combine to create a very unique and useful AI. Well, let's see what happens with that. But it's really worrisome because you and I did not grant permission for that. And again, so what I'd like to see is transparency about data collection, data use, right? How do you incentivize that? So many of these companies are either government owned or, so they're not, laws is not going to be able to reach them, right? But if we started, let's say, the EU, the US, Canada, Australia, Taiwan, by the way, Taiwan is really good on AI too, and said we should agree on various standards of how companies should report to their stakeholders about data, I think that would be extremely helpful. The problem is there are no standards for that, right? But they owe that to us because, again, as so many people have said before we are the product.
More questions? Yes. Becky, could you come down? Well, let's go that lady first and then this gentleman in the front.
Send me your paper. I'm sorry I didn't answer your question.
Actually, a related question. I'm Aubrey. I'm a technology executive, American expat, who lives here. I'm really interested in, the U.S. lacking sort of comprehensive privacy legislation, I would say hasn't meaningfully hindered sort of US hegemony in terms of technology exports in a lot of ways. And I'm wondering if you see that shifting, because maybe I'm a little cynical about the US's ability to coordinate to get like really risk-aware, harm-reductive legislation in place. But I'm curious if you see kind of the economic impact of American companies being able to export their technology as we see stricter regulations popping up in other jurisdictions.
You know, you're making such a fabulous point. If you had made it 2 years ago, if I may reframe your point, so it is a little bit odd. Although Facebook adheres, right, to EU, the GDPR, et cetera. I'm sorry, I'm using Facebook as the whipping boy, but it deserves a little whipping, okay? You know, they do follow the law in every country that they operate in. So that's why, you know, America's failure I think it's hampered the brands, but it hasn't hindered the marketplace, which is odd. You're making such a good point. But interesting, I was just talking about this with Tom and Haley a while back. The United States' position on this has changed for several reasons, right? The Biden administration really wants to regulate tech, which is understandable, right? We've been waiting for a long time. How they plan to do it is very unclear. And what really worries me is the free flow of data. So the United States, right, supposedly built its economy based on the free flow of goods and services, right? We do have certain exceptions, but in general, that has been the United States' position since, you know, ever gradually since 1934, but really since the development of the GATT, so let's say 48. But you probably know this if you work for a tech company, but shocking to everybody, the Biden administration announced that it no longer supported what's called white papers or green papers at the WTO, which related to that. The United States clarified its position and said, we still support the free flow of data, we just don't support those papers that we had. Papers are like a bunch of nations get together and say, this is our position on this issue. Well, after that came, I think, almost a year after the Democracy Summit, which was at the White House, where the United States said the free flow of data is essential to democracy, to addressing corruption. It is essential to innovation as well. So the United States looked so hypocritical. It also did not inform its allies in advance of that, and that was terrible. But the White House invited groups of people to come in and talk about it, and you know, like any other government, one agency has X position, and another agency, let's call it the State Department, has Y position, and so this is still a real problem, methinks, because I feel very strongly that we need the free flow of data, and the United States should be leading that effort, as it has since 1997 with the Global Framework for E-commerce. With that said, though, Elizabeth Warren really matters. And Elizabeth Warren, a young woman who worked for her, heads what's called the FTC. And this young woman, whose name is Lena Khan, has done a fabulous job of really going after tech companies for lies and bad behavior. But again, without legislation saying how to regulate these companies, she can investigate, like we have an investigation of OpenAI right now regarding stealing data, basically. But the investigation, who knows the status of it? And an investigation is not, I'm sorry to be redundant, a law saying this is how companies must behave in the US market. So you have these contradictions happening where everyone should welcome the United States regulating its data behemoths, right? Facebook, Google, Netflix, Amazon, etc. it is in our interest as consumers, but it is also in our interest to have clear free flow of data rules, because if you believe in democracy, the free flow of information is essential. I'm not saying that the world is black and white, we're either the great firewall or you have the free flow of data, but the United States to change its position so dramatically was, in my view, shocking.
Becky, I think is there still a question at the front?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Susan, and I really appreciate your insights. I think
You have to introduce yourself.
Thank you, sir. My name's Peter Singh. I work on Azure OpenAI at Microsoft and also represent the transhuman community here around emerging tech. I think, what you said about the hallucinations as well, I think the technology is moving quite fast, and we've seen even from a year ago, even the images that were being generated and now videos are a lot more lifelike, and the world models that these models are having inside are actually a lot more accurate, including the grounding of those outputs. So do you foresee over the next 5 years, as these models get better and it becomes more general purpose, as you say, like electricity, that there might be an action around the nationalization of some of these tech companies?
It's already happening.
For example, like of OpenAI.
That paper gives examples of it. And that is terrifying because, I don't know if you note the inconsistencies in my position here. I want the companies to be regulated. I also want them to be successful. I want as much competition as possible among them. There's contradictions in that, right? And so, but governments, including the United States, are terrified to regulate these companies because they are the future, right? And they are also providing the defense side of it. So let's just take the war in Ukraine or the war in Palestine. What you see there is the first war really using tons of AI. And I'm not just talking about drones, ladies and gentlemen. I'm talking about how they target, militants or other people. So I hesitate to predict the future, Peter, but because I think it's already happening, and it's scary.
There's another question over here, this side of the audience. This lady.
Over your sec. Thank you. I'm Flip. I work at the NBC. If you ever come to talk to us, please hook yourself up. So I think more people love to hear from you. Can the companies be regulated? Because we're in a really interesting situation here that maybe not many people are aware of, but a whole bunch of media companies have just shed a bunch of staff because they had deals going with Facebook around, to compensate them for the loss of data that these companies were taking on. That deal has just fallen over with all these companies. And we've just seen hundreds of staff let go at those companies. Right. And Facebook has said people don't want news on their platform, which is a really interesting claim because I follow many, many news outlets, and the algorithm has recently stopped showing me news even though I'm an active participant. And they're changing my worldview by not showing me the stuff that they think causes a conflict and is worth something. So I guess the question is really, people aren't really aware of the extent to which algorithms dictate what they see. And Facebook can turn the dial and just switch it off for its own gain. So I don't know, I feel like we're up against this company with billions of users, they have the data. Can we really fight them?
Well, I think everyone needs to think very carefully about who should control the free flow of information in a democracy or even in a non-democracy. And I was funded by, I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the name of the foundation, but it is in Australia in Perth. Minderoo. And
we only have a couple.
they funded some webinars that we did, basically starting with the news bargaining code. And initially I thought this is really good because I hate to use that cliche, leveling the playing field. But Australia, this is a great dilemma. is too little to matter to Facebook, right? So you don't, it's a different problem in the United States, but 38 million people is not even, that's Canada, that is having the same problem. Indonesia is not gonna have the same problem, right? Because you know, I don't know why we're using Facebook, but again, you know, whatever Indonesia's population is, I'm making this up, 130 million, that's sizable. That is a growth market for Facebook. And if people want news on their feed, they'll probably have it there. But I worry about what you just said, and I don't know how to wake people up to that, because, and I welcome any ideas that you have, because news should not come from AI or from avatars, or it has to, you know, I need not tell you this, but it is worrisome, and that response was so flippant and morally bankrupt. But is the answer for government to pay for news? That may not work in many cultures. You know, certainly in an adversarial culture like the United States, it won't be trusted. But I don't have any answers, but we do know this, right? Look at the track record of how, you know, not without intent. Certainly there are travel agents today, right? I think one booked my flight, but that profession is, you know, FlightAware and Google, you know, have made it so you don't need a travel agent as much. And I think the same is happening with generative AI and journalism. But I can't pretend to say I have any answers to that, and I'd welcome your ideas on it. That is something, you know, the NSF-NIST Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society should be doing. That is not what we're doing. We're not looking at the sectoral impact at all of AI, only because our sort of mission is to try to get people more involved in the debate. So we're at 60,000 feet. It's good to know I've used a mic before. And you know, you're at the real world level.
What about, Susan, just to leverage off that question, I mean, when you look at electric vehicles, you know, 20 years ago there weren't electric vehicles, and it's only because people have decided, you know, they want to assist with reducing emissions, they want to be climate conscious, that they're actually going out buying EVs. What about some sort of public backlash against AI or against the other kind of media companies or social media companies? Could there be something that's driven by the ground up where people say, actually, we're not going to support this, we want something better?
Yeah, well, you should be very concerned about your car and insurance. If you have an electric vehicle or many other types of cars, given that they are computers, they are monitoring how and when you brake, how often you brake, that kind of thing. And if you bought a new car, you should make sure you read the fine print on how they use your data, because it can raise your insurance rates, etc. if you tend to drive drunk or whatever. You get my point. People have not woken up to this at all, and I don't know how to wake them up to it. Regarding your question, there is actually a movement in the United States. It came out of an economist at Microsoft. You may know him. His name is Glenn Weil. And Glenn wrote a book with many other very famous economists. And the basic thesis of the book was that data is labor. And so this is not the book about Taiwan, that's the new book. But his book is basically trying to create a movement of people to take back their data, find new ways to control who gets to use their data and when. I think that's incredibly awkward, and I have yet to see a intermediary, fiduciary, that can really handle that for us the way other fiduciaries handle various tasks for us as middlemen. But again, you know, these are very new. It takes time for people to come up with ideas. One idea that's out there is called data trust. I'm sorry, I don't think it's there yet.
Well, we've come to the end of the hour.
Thank you.
I hope everyone goes out for a stiff drink and enjoys the rest of the evening. No, I really do hope that AI at least is a bit like the internet, where the internet is life-changing and culturally impactful, and it can be used for good and for evil, but it's a tool in the end, and how we decide to use it is up to us. So the future's in our hands. Could you please all join me in thanking Susan Elliott?